Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/homesoon.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. I'm not in the CHEK News World Headquarters. A little bit more relaxed as summer approaches and that hot weather is here, but we still got lots of BC political material for you. It is a very busy time in BC politics. We have Jeff Ferrier and Allie Blades. You know them. Love them from each and every week here. Jillian is off this week, but we are going to dive in to quite a few topics, see if we can get through them here on the show. Make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast where we have an extended conversation about some of these issues. Let's begin with Donald Trump again announcing late Thursday a 35% tariff potentially on Canadian goods starting August 1st in a letter to the Prime Minister, a dramatic re-escalation of a trade war that had died down a little bit. It felt like a little bit more calm since Prime Minister Mark Carney came in. Premier David Eby launching his reply. And here we go again, back to the old wartime footing of the provincial government. So, Jeff, let's start with you on this. What do we do now? And also, here's the hypothesis I'm going to put out, and you're not going to agree with it, but we can talk about it. Does this help the Eby government return to the idea of fighting Donald Trump, fighting tariffs, economic patriotism, and move away from a lot of the other issues that you and we've been talking about each and every week in healthcare, crime, and the other sort of domestic issues that are proving to be problematic for this government?
Yeah, I think some people will be looking at those approval numbers. I'm not sure it's the premier who's going to be doing that. And just practically speaking, you saw at the end of COVID, there was no real bump for the government after COVID was done, after the crisis had finished. So it's I don't think it holds water that something that they do early in the government that's a crisis. I think some people will want to put that behind them, and it creates a problem for government more than a solution. I think the numbers that the government is focused on is the number of jobs that are at risk, the hit on GDP, the hit on government revenues, what that means in terms of money for healthcare, education, housing, public safety, the hot button issues that are forefront of British Columbians' mind right now. And what do we have to do? I think all the Canadian premiers are doing this. I think Premier Eby is doing this well, diversifying our trading partners, speeding up economic development projects in the province to make sure that we have a strong economy that is resilient, stands on its own 2 feet, and we can resist the economic, you said, economic war that Donald Trump has launched in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Allie, what do you think of what this does for the provincial political scene? Again, to have this as a top issue.
My brain also went to relating it to the pandemic, as Jeff just did, because it's something that happened to us as Canadians, and then it was uncertain, and we just didn't quite know how long it was going to last and what was the best course of action at the time. So here we are again, where something is happening to Canadian businesses, and where we're relying on elected officials to guide us through this. There is an expiration date, though, on how tolerant we are of the platitudes of elbows up, or we're working on it, or hope is on the way, because eventually the time will pass that we're hoping as Canadians that something will actually deliver. And that's why I think that most elected representatives have been given a bit of grace. It's certainly impacted the trajectory of a lot of things in Canada, or the influence rather. Take a look at the federal general election. But where are we at right now? So all of the premiers are going to come together in a couple of weeks, next week, July 21st to be exact. The Prime Minister is now coming to that meeting. And sure enough, the importance of that meeting is critical, because they'll likely gather to talk about, well, what do we do in this yet another Trump response to these tariffs? But what I think is going to be more interesting is how each of the premiers position themselves. Work with me here. We saw an MOU with the Alberta and Ontario government last week announced at the Stampede, where generally every elected representative gathers. And so what I noticed from that is that BC was visibly left out of that conversation. And so is David Eby going to this meeting in Ontario, positioning himself in a way that he can reinsert BC into the larger conversation? I think that's what I'm certainly going to be watching for. But back to your question, like, something's got to give, something actually has to be delivered. I say we're probably looking at like the end of the year until Canadians start to ask, okay, so what were the action items from these various meetings? Just like anything else, like we want accountability, and we can't just say whatever to delay time from these electeds.
Mm-hmm. It is the timelines are interesting, Jeff, because we spent a lot of time talking about, say, for example, eliminating interprovincial trade barriers on liquor. But then there was an agreement signed this week from the provinces that says that's not actually going to happen until next spring because it's very complicated and elbows up, but complicated kind of thing. What's the runway on having to deliver things in this versus kind of you're putting another Canadian flag in front of the legislature and then and sort of kind of wailing on Trump on social media sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I think Allie raises good points on that front. I think you've seen government move quickly on green energy projects, speeding up the building of those. That represents $1 billion and more in the British Columbia economy. We've seen Highland Valley Copper from CHEK get permits and approvals and authorizations ready to go in the BC interior. LNG Canada has just shipped its first LNG to Asia. So there are things happening, but the government needs to do a lot more and quickly. The good news is there are a lot of projects, actual projects with proponents, with customers, with business plans, authorization requests in front of government, particularly in areas like critical minerals, which is the belle of the ball these days. So BC has an opportunity to do that build thing. Allie's right; it needs to happen sooner rather than later. I just want to pick up on one point that Allie makes about the BC being left out of conversations with Ontario and Alberta. I think the Premier has made a political choice to focus on Asia Pacific. The investors with the money, the folks who we can diversify our trade economy with. People have asked me, well, why was the Premier not at the last First Ministers meeting? It's because he went where the money is and he went where the investors were. And I think, his sense was meeting with those folks instead of another gab fest with premiers was the right thing to do for British Columbia.
That could very well be true, but I think two things can be true at the same time, in that this is also, in my opinion, a repercussion of the last time we were on a federal stage where our elected representatives in BC were saying that there's not a business proposal for pipelines in front of them. It's where I argued that it's not about talking about these hypothetical issues, but rather making sure that we are invited to the table when others are having the conversation. This also goes to there's a shift in dynamics of the relationship with the Prime Minister and various provinces. And right now, what we're seeing is Danielle Smith and Doug Ford at the top for all of their asks. Meanwhile, that David Eby is nowhere to be seen, but potentially, I'm also just not sure what he's asking of the Prime Minister's office either.
Yeah, we on pipelines, I guess. But Jeff, if we go to the pipeline issue, does it increase the pressure on the Premier to kind of do more than just say, well, I haven't seen a project in front of me, therefore I don't have anything to say about it, if that now becomes another dominant theme brought up by this tariff threat?
Yeah, I think the Premier is frustrated. I think he's frustrated that a Premier who uses separation as a cudgel to get attention from the federal government is getting it, and that they're getting it on projects that don't exist, that don't have a proponent, that don't have customers, that don't have a plan. And he's going to Ottawa and his people are going to Ottawa, I have no doubt, pounding on the doors of the federal government there with actual projects, with actual proponents, with actual customers. I talked about critical minerals before. LNG, there's LNG projects, Indigenous-led in the north, Sea Lissoms. Huge potential investment, a real project. And I think the Premier is frustrated that everything is focusing on a project that will be years and years and years and years away, when there are projects on the doorstep right now, ready to go if the federal government joins BC and gets behind them.
What do you think, Allie, should the Premier put out something like Christy Clark put out with a Northern Gateway pipeline, which was, here's a series of British Columbia's, demands. If you're going to do this, we want, world-class Coast Guard funding. We want spill protection here. We want the partnerships here. We want this amount of revenue. We want that. Like, would that help put BC on the stage? But as Jeff points out, there is no project, unlike Northern Gateway. We don't have a proponent to argue against. We don't have any numbers. There's no, but what do you make of that idea of, or are we headed there eventually anyways, do you think?
I think that's a great idea, actually. So that there must be things that we could benefit from in BC, whether it's a faster approval process, making sure that we're taking care of our coastlines. To your point, it's a true British Columbian identity that we have, is making sure that we're taking care of our coastlines. But my perception of the Premier is that, in comparison to someone like Christy Clark, who saw that vision to bring that LNG to this province, is that there isn't something that's forward-thinking in a way that's going to economically take care of us for years to come. I've always seen him as a very reactive Premier, versus even just during the last election, we didn't see something in his platform that said, this is what's going to be our life raft for generations to come.
Mm-hmm. No, it is mining, I guess, now, Jeff.
Critical minerals. Allie, critical minerals. I say this more than anyone in the province of British Columbia. Okay. Critical minerals. You raised Christy Clark. I want to say something nice about Christy Clark and those 5 conditions.
Oh, here we go.
One of the conditions was a fair return for British Columbia from the transport of gas, oil through British Columbia. You want to know one of the reasons why BC wants to maximize the amount of oil that's going through Trans Mountain? Because they get a percentage. They get a percentage, which is money going into a treasury where there's not a whole lot of money right now, where we're facing Trump. And every little bit of money, every bit of percentage that they're factored in and we get is thanks to Christy Clark and that negotiating she did in the 5 conditions. So there you go. Jeff says something nice about Christy Clark.
Well, I do think we're going to end up in a situation where BC is going to have to put another Clark style kind of series of demands on the table, but it's just when do we get there, and when does that benefit the province the most? Let's talk about another issue. One of our major Asia Pacific trading partners, apparently China, and BC and the BC Ferries China contract deal, which continues to be a brewing issue provincially and federally. The federal Conservatives coming out swinging on this week. Pierre Poilievre arriving in Vancouver saying that this contract needs to be canceled, that the funding should be pulled. The $1 billion loan from Ottawa equated it to funding slave labor in China. The opposition has started the Parliamentary Committee on Transportation federally. They're going to compel the CEO of BC Ferries to testify, along with some federal cabinet ministers and others. Allie, what does this do to that issue, which has been a provincial issue, but is now growing into much more of a federal issue? How does it change the dynamic of this? Does it make it any more likely that this isn't going to happen or will happen? Are people entrenching? What does it all look like, do you think?
I'm a realistic person that I understand that this is probably still going to happen, despite the various opposition, just because, well, who else is going to build it? And it's going to end up costing Canadians way more, which is another problem that we just can't quite actually afford. But what I do like about all of this is that it means that these elected representatives, particularly Chrystia Freeland and Minister Gregor Robertson, have to actually stand by some of their choices. And that's like the fun of opposition. And that's why I'm very proud that the Conservatives federally put forward this in the Transportation Committee to start having these conversations, because what it means is that where Freeland tried to hide behind a letter before in very calculated words, they were very specific to try to be seen as someone who opposes this. Now she has to double down and defend it even more, which is not a great look for them. So I quite like the sport of this, is that, we might not win the battle in this, but we will have some fun in throwing some punches.
Yeah. Jeff, what do you think this does to the issue? Now the federal Liberal government is all tied up in it. Does it change the dynamic at all?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is that Pierre Poilievre always goes like that one step a little bit too far, which is probably why he has some party members behind the scenes raising questions about his leadership. He'll hold on. He'll be fine, and he'll win his seat, and he'll be back. I think that what this is a case study in crisis communications, and crisis communications gone wrong. I think that all of this is entirely predictable. As soon as that decision was made by BC Ferries and the government failed to step in to put a stop to it, it set in wheels the motion of everything that we've seen in terms of opposition, pushback, in terms of union response. And now at the federal level, initially the Liberals were angry about it, and then it turns out that they loaned money to BC Ferries to do this. And now you have the federal opposition. They're not going to do a wide-ranging conversation with the CEO of BC Ferries and those ministers. There's just going to be speeches attacking them on the national stage. So, a lesson to folks who see difficult times coming in ahead because of decisions that they've made: get to the end game right at the start. And so you can avoid this long denouement of difficulties that you're going to face from decisions that are going to be hugely unpopular with your voters.
Jeff, just staying with you, do you think is there any possibility that this leads to it somehow being canceled in some way, federally or provincially?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand the legal obligations about it. I just think from a political perspective, it's something that should have been explored an awful lot more than it was.
Okay. All right. Allie, any final thoughts on that?
To Jeff's point, it's just outrageous to me that politicians will never have a humble moment at the very beginning. They very well could have said, Christopher Freeland could have very well said, this is not the best case scenario, but to my point, we can't afford the alternative. So here we are. She's been through these situations before, so I have no doubt that she will be able to navigate this quite well. But Minister Gregor Robertson, on the other hand, this is the first time on a federal stage that he will have to really endure some of this negative attention on him. And so I'm very interested to see how he navigates this. And does he potentially lose some brownie points in favorability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's his first sort of big test in that role, and has nothing to do with housing, everything to do with some crown infrastructure bank that we barely ever talk about. But here we go. One final issue, I want to get this in here. The BC Greens have now finalized their leadership candidate slate. We talked a little bit about it last week. There are 3 candidates that have been named: Adam Bremner-Aikens, Emily Lowen, and Jonathan Kerr. Jonathan Kerr is a family doctor from Comox. He's on council. Emily Lowen, a 24-year-old climate justice organizer with the Fight the Oligarchs Fund Our Future campaign. And Bremner-Aikens is a political science student from SFU who was, I think, the Greens' secretary and had been on provincial council. Jeff, 2 young people, one, Emily Lowen, proposing to sign up more members than the party has to kind of take it over, I guess, versus a family doctor who is talking a little bit more about taking the party, I think, in a little bit into the center. What do you make of this dynamic for the Greens and what this means for their leadership race?
I think it's all about organizing. It's a small member party. The person who signs up the most members is gonna win and become the next leader. I think we've seen leadership races recently when folks summoned organization that was better, also illegal, against someone who was seen as a front runner and the clear establishment choice. I think there needs to be a fourth candidate. It needs to be someone who will come in with and use questionable organizing tactics with potentially illegal third-party corporate support to try and take over the party, even though they're not really a member of that party.
Who knows? Well, I hope the Greens pull this vote off without any scandal, but it feels like every leadership race has some type of,
intrigue for sure.
Intrigue, yeah. Allie, close us off on this. Now that we have these three, this dynamic, the Green vote is in September. I think 24th we get the results. I saw Jonathan Kerr already go to Prince George, Kelowna, Kamloops, starting in parts of the province. There's almost no Green presence. How do you think this might play for the Greens here?
As I mentioned last week, I think this is really healthy for the Greens in that going across the province gives them that opportunity to engage new members and hopefully recruit more to help them with election readiness. One of the trends that I think are potentially going to impact what's going on here in BC, and listen, I'm no expert in what's happening with the NDP or the Greens on any part of or any corner of this country, but I did read something this week that I thought was very interesting in that as it relates to the federal NDP leadership campaign, there's a little bit of a group that is curious what it would be like to just merge the Greens and the NDP together federally to help them have a little bit more of a boost. And so because of some of those conversations that are happening federally, I wonder if it will trickle down to BC at all. Granted, BC has always been a bit of a unique circumstance on a lot of fronts, but it's a very interesting position that some Green members are talking about and some NDPers are talking about federally.
That'd be the death of the NDP if they did that. If you look at the combined vote of urban hipster doofus New Democrats and Greens, you have enough to elect maybe 3 people. Whereas the NDP, when it spoke to working people about bread and butter issues, actually won seats and had influence in Parliament. Mm-hmm. But we'll see. It might. You're right, Allie. It might very well become part of the conversation here in the BC Greens race.
Yeah, feels like more of a federal kind of merger and marriage. You're right, but very interesting. Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you, Jeff and Allie, for being here. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the audio podcast for more conversation. We'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/home soon.